Hello, welcome to our evening. My name is Ellie Gettinger, and I'm the Education Director at Jewish Museum Milwaukee. We are so excited to have you here tonight, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this virtual presentation of The Lost Family, How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are. And we're presenting this program in partnership with the National Museum of Jewish American History and the Young Leadership Division of the Milwaukee Jewish Federation. I ask for your patience, as I do every time, about if there are any technical glitches that might occur this evening. For many of you, I know you've been on lots and lots of Zooms before, so you know the drill. But if please use the chat feature rather than unmuting or muting yourself. Let us know what you think there. You can leave questions and comments throughout. We'll be reviewing those. Someone from the programs team will attempt to assist you if there's a problem aside from your questions. Also, if you want to be, everyone should be muted, but please make sure you stay on mute. It'll make everything more pleasant. And once we get to the questions period, just put them in the chat and I'll be reviewing it, as will my colleagues who are on board with me here. To get the best experience possible from your virtual book club, what I would suggest is making sure that you are on the speaker view and that you pin whoever is speaking up to the front so you have a really good picture of hopefully mostly Libby tonight, as opposed to the Brady Bunch style or Hollywood Squares style piece. If you have questions on how to find that, it's generally at the top corner in the right where it says gallery view versus speaker view. I know many of you already made a donation to support the work that we're doing. The donations will be split between the Jewish Museum Milwaukee, National Museum of Jewish American History, and we are excited to I'm excited to welcome my colleague from the National Museum of Jewish American History tonight. And he's going to be presenting this next piece. But what I would also like to say is the thing about this moment in museums and organizations all over the world is all of us are doing something new and different. And for so many of us, we had this moment where we're like, no, we have to go it alone. We have to do this together. We have to do it by ourselves because this is our space. This is our niche. This is how we do things. And I think what we've learned in quarantine is that we're all in the same boat. And the nice thing is that tonight we can have a program with people from all over the country, and Libby can be presenting from, I believe you're in New York, am I right? And we can be in Philly and in Milwaukee and probably lots of other places I've not even considered, and we can have this moment together. So we are taking this silver lining and we are running with it. And with that, I am delighted to turn it over to my colleague, Daniel Samuels, Public Programs Manager at the National Museum of American Jewish History.
Hey, everybody. Here we go. How about that? That looks better. My name is Daniel Samuels. I'm the Public Programs Manager at the National Museum of American Jewish History, just as Ellie introduced. Thank you so much. We're here in Philadelphia, and really just here to echo a lot of what Ellie just said. You know, given the state of the world, especially the arts and culture industry, you know, we're operating on shoestring budgets, and many of our museums are physically closed. But you know, there are so many silver linings of this sort of COVID era that we're living through. And one of them that I am really appreciating tonight is the ease with which we can partner with other like-minded institutions around the world and around the country, swap that. And I've had such a great time getting to know some of the folks at the Jewish Museum in Milwaukee over the last few weeks, Molly and Cassie especially, shout out. You all are great, well organized, putting together great programs, and yeah, just really happy to be partnering here. I've also been in conversation with Libby's team for a few months now, probably more than a few months, and so I'm personally excited that this is finally happening. Libby has some fabulous folks working with her and for her. Coley is the name that I'm remembering right now, done a great job. But we've also gotten lots of questions and comments from our stakeholders at NMAJH, Namaj as we call ourselves, with suggesting a lot of interest in the various subjects around genealogy. So many reasons for me personally and for us as an institution to be excited about tonight. Again, more echoing, just grateful that everybody is tuning in to tonight's program. Certainly going to be very interesting, echoing a call for donation. We're operating on shoestring budgets, and you know, every little bit does count and help us to continue putting on programs such as this one. Last thing I'll say is just a little bit of self-plugging. Like I said, we're the National Museum of American Jewish History, and while we are physically closed, we are digitally open 24/7. Would you figure? And I just encourage you to check out our website anytime. We have virtual exhibitions available on Jewish farming, World War II, military nurses, women's suffrage, a very cool baseball exhibition called Chasing Dreams, Becoming American, a really cool exhibition on Leonard Bernstein, the very famous composer. And upcoming, we have a free concert next Wednesday, September 16th. I'm calling it Lunchtime Ladino, with a Ladino artist named Sarah Aroesti. So I urge you to check all that stuff out. Oh, look, in the comments, it's happening right there. And like us on Instagram and Facebook, NMAJH, and on Twitter, you can follow us, the same handle. And now that I've talked your ear off, I will hand the baton off and just tell you, please enjoy the rest of the program. And thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much, Dan. And I can say we hosted part of the smaller version of Chasing Dreams, and it is a phenomenal exhibit, as is all of the work that you do. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Libby Copeland. And I have to say, when we do programs, a lot of times I read the book, sometimes I don't. This one I could not put down. And I'm so excited to have this opportunity to talk with Libby about this book, which you all should purchase. It is an awesome read. And one of the things that I will say about this book is that she does a marvelous job of matching science and story, and the two come together in a really interesting way. And on top of that, you have all of the social history and kind of this real question of what are we living through and what are the repercussions. So Libby is an award-winning journalist and author. She writes from New York about culture, science, and human behavior. You see all three of these pieces at play in The Lost Family. As a freelance journalist, she writes for such media outlets as The Atlantic, Slate, New York, Smithsonian, The New York Times, The New Republic, Esquire, The Wall Street Journal, and more. And her book was just released in March by Adams Press. The Lost Family, as a setup, explores the rapidly evolving phenomenon of home DNA testing and its implications for how we think about our family and ourselves, and its ramifications for American culture broadly. And I did a quick poll of people who were in early, and of the 24 people who voted, this is amazing, Libby, you won't believe this, exactly 10 of them had taken a test, exactly 10 of them had not taken a test, and 4 haven't taken one but are planning to. So it'll be interesting to see if those results change at the end of this. But I wanted to jump in to kind of your narrative arc. This is a book that is a scientific book. It talks a lot about the science of DNA testing, but at its core, it's a story about families and how families discover who they are. How did you pick the individual story that became the kind of linchpin for this, the story of Alice? And in particular, what does it mean in this particular story? She discovers fairly early on, so I'm not spoiling much, that you are Jewish. What do you think it means to discover that?
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for having me. I'm like delighted to be here, really excited. So yeah, there were a lot of stories that I wanted to tell in this book, but I wanted to kind of propel the reader through with a really compelling narrative. I had to choose a narrative that I thought would make people want to turn the page. And so I chose a story that's a bit of a genetic whodunit, if you will. It's a kind of a story with a lot of twists and turns. And the story begins with a woman named Alice in 2012. And she tests through Ancestry DNA, which is the largest company that offers DNA testing. And she gets unexpected results, as you said. She's expecting that her results, when you do a DNA test, and those of you who've done it will be familiar, you get two major things. You get a list of genetic relatives, people who have also tested with the same company, who are genetically related to you, say within the range or a fifth cousin or closer, generally. And then you get a pie chart. It looks like a pie, and it's sort of split up by your genetic ancestry, or your ethnicity, as Ancestry calls it. And so Alice is expecting a pie that's entirely Irish American with a little British Isles and Scots, but basically pretty much Irish. And what she gets instead is a pie that is split down the middle. On one side, it's Irish American and British Isles, and on the other side, it is Ashkenazi Jewish. And what's very, very compelling about her story, and the reason that I chose it, is because she dives into this mystery of how her results could be so unexpected, and it takes her 2.5 years to understand. And she kind of, I guess you would say, grabs the mystery by the shoulders and shakes it. She builds essentially a database of her own DNA, and she basically makes this into her full-time job. And with the help of her sister, she works every single day for 2.5 years to understand how her results could be so different than she expected. It's important to think about the range of possible ways that you could have an unexpected DNA result. And the most common scenarios were the ones that Alice thought of right away. So for instance, a really common way in which you might get an unexpected DNA result would be if you're not genetically related to the man you consider your father. And that is so common that it's become known as an NPE, for non-paternity event, or not parent expected. It does occasionally happen also with mothers, particularly in cases perhaps where someone is adopted and they find out they're not genetically related to either parent. So there are these more common scenarios. Perhaps you could discover your donor conceived, for instance, or adopted, or not genetically related to your dad, or for historical reasons, your family's ethnicity was hidden at some point from you or from the generation before you. So there are all these sort of more typical explanations for this surprise that Alice gets. And the reason that Alice's story is so compelling is because none of the typical explanations explain her story. None of them explain her mystery. And it takes her a very long time to understand why. So what Alice's story gives me the opportunity to do is not only explore her tale, but tell some of the stories of the more than 400 people who reached out to me to tell me their stories after I wrote about DNA testing in the Washington Post back in 2017. And I just got loads of emails from people being like, let me tell you my DNA surprise story. Let me tell you how it's changed my view of myself, my family, my place in this world, my ethnicity, my race. And these stories were absolutely amazing. And so I wanted to tell some of those stories too. Explaining the industry of DNA testing is, it's filled with science. It's very complicated. There's a lot of interesting stuff, but also very granular stuff having to do with the businesses and the privacy and issues like that. And I really wanted a very human story to push the reader through. What very much interested me about Alice's story as well, and you were asking about this, Ellie, is what does it mean in particular to discover that you're Jewish? And I really wanted to explore that because I was interested in how much DNA can tell us and how much it can't. There's all of these questions about what is ethnicity, right? Is it experience? Is it your genetic ancestry? Truly, ethnicity is, in many ways, the things that you grow up with, religion, customs, spoken language, foods that you eat. But to some extent, people's experiences of themselves do get altered by these DNA tests. And so what does it mean for Alice to discover that she's half Jewish? And I sort of explore that through the book. And I find that for her, DNA versus experience, or nature versus nurture, is not a binary thing. And I found this over and over in my interviews, often lengthy interviews that I conducted with people over the course of months and even over years. You know, it's not that you are one thing and then all of a sudden you're something else. There's a famous Ancestry ad where a guy is wearing lederhosen because he believes he's German, and then he finds out he's Scottish, and he takes off his lederhosen and he puts on a kilt, and he says, "I traded in my lederhosen for a kilt." And we all know that that's sort of facile and flat and lacking in a true comprehension of, you know, of what it means to be human and what it means to grow up in a certain culture. But at the same time, if that ethnic heritage, or that genetic ancestry, I should say, is germane to your experience, as Alice discovers that it was, and if you are someone who's interested in genealogy and your own family's history, and the unraveling of that, of how that mysterious ancestry came to be, becomes part of your own life, many people do claim that, and that is what Alice did. She hails from a large Irish Catholic family. There are 7 siblings, and when I would put to each sibling this question of what does your genetic Jewishness mean to you, each person would give me a different answer. So as I say in The Lost Family, the question of how much does your genetic Jewishness mean to you is a question with a 7-sided answer for the family, the Collins family that she comes from. But Alice takes it in deeply, and she's very committed to understanding the whole of her history when she has it revealed to her through DNA.
I think one of the things that I think is most remarkable, aside from the trajectory, the Alice trajectory is unbelievable. But the fact that her name is Alice, it couldn't be more perfect, that she's on this like journey, and you're like, it was like almost 2 on the nose. So you started talking about how this process started. It started with an article for the Washington Post that you were commissioned to create. Did you have any sense at the start of that this was going to be a multi-year book project, and hundreds of interviews later and taking you all over the country and all over the world to talk to people?
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
And I think my big question is that I found the way that you dealt with science to be very accessible,
Right.
The DNA piece. And so how did you kind of connect with those players and really start to form a language of talking about it?
Thank you.
The science of DNA.
That was complicated, and so thank you. Okay, so did I anticipate it would be a book? Not necessarily, but when I wrote the article, I thought this is so much bigger than one article, and so I created a Gmail address. You know, it's very easy to just create a Gmail address. I asked the Post editor, would they pop in at the bottom, and you know, just write, you know, in some language about like, if you're interested in sharing your DNA testing experiences, please reach out to me at this email address. But it wasn't till the responses started pouring in that I thought, oh, wow, okay, this is more than like maybe a series of articles. This is potentially a book. And the emails that I got were from people who had tested anytime over the last, like, I would say 7 years to that point, because DNA testing really started to take off around 2010, 2011, 2012 is when you see the type of DNA testing we're talking about really become available and available for purchase. And these were people who were grappling with the after effects of many, many years of processing really profound revelations in some cases. Sometimes it's something like, you know, my grandfather isn't who I thought, but sometimes it's something like my father isn't who I thought. And that can be absolutely, you know, sort of earth-shaking. It can be really heartbreaking for people. It can be the means through which they discover new family. It can be really bittersweet. And what I came to realize was that people were still actively processing these revelations, and that this was something that was happening to people all across America, and that it mattered for a few reasons to everyone. It mattered because people that I talked to were grappling with very essential human questions we all think about. These are questions that are relevant to you whether or not you ever take a DNA test. Who are you? Is it nature or nurture, right? How much does the past get to tell us about who you are? Is the past ever really over? And how is it that the past, something that happened 50 years ago, how is it able to like change your feelings about the present moment and cause you to like go back and rethink your own self? So incredibly sort of profound things. And not only is it interesting because these are essential human questions, and therefore I think they're important whether or not you take a DNA test, but increasingly all of us as Americans are implicated by a technology that now so many Americans have already involved themselves in. And because we share our DNA with other people, I share my DNA with, thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of people, up to say a third, fourth cousin level. Someone else's decision to test has implications for me. And that means that if, for instance, I choose to take a DNA test, let's say one of my brothers had conceived a child 40 years ago or 30 years ago, and like maybe even didn't know it, like conceived this child in high school. And I decide to take a DNA test. The child, if that child of my brother, so a nephew or a niece of mine, is looking for him, he or she can find my brother and figure out his identity based on my decision to test. And that means that all of us have to start thinking about how our decision is reshaping the family at large, not just necessarily for yourself, but maybe for your siblings, your first cousins, your second, your third cousins. And I just think that's really fascinating. I mean, this is a recreational entertainment technology with these enormous unintended consequences that, and I want to be careful to say that unintended doesn't necessarily mean bad, because people have profound experiences that they're very glad to know the truth about themselves in some cases. But we didn't set out looking for this, right? When you pay $59 and you spit into a vial, you don't set out looking for it. As far as the complications of the science, and I appreciate you saying that it was somewhat comprehensible. I mean, I am not a scientist, and I was very aware of the limitations of the fact that I don't have a PhD in genetics. And so what I had to do when I was in conversation with scientists was to get them to explain it to me in a way that I truly understood it in order to explain it to other people. And that meant asking what probably sounded to them like very dumb questions over and over again. And then at the end process, after I had written the book, having a geneticist read the book, having scientists and genetic counselors read chapters and portions of the book just to make sure that it was accurate, but also that it was comprehensible, because this is not stuff that most of us at this granular level learn even in college.
I think that was like one of the things that you're like, oh my, that you start really thinking about how all of these different pieces come together and all of these different types of tests and all of the different ways that people can be exposed or found, I mean, on both sides of the coin. So you were able to interview a number of players within the DNA industry. And I had a question about just access. Was there were they pretty open and accommodating, or was there a sense of, wait, we'll give you this much information and make sure you're not reflecting this? Were there big, firewalls that they were not interested in letting you into?
That's a great question. Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it's like, it's interesting to me because I'm a reporter. I was at the Washington Post for 11 years before I went freelance. And these questions about the nuts and bolts of reporting are endlessly fascinating to me. So you really have a range. There are 4 major DNA testing companies. The largest is Ancestry, which has its Ancestry DNA products. And then there's 23andMe, which has a database that is still quite large, but not quite as big. And then there's MyHeritage, and there's Family Tree DNA, which is the oldest. It was founded just about exactly 20 years ago. It sent out its first test kits, April of 2000. So this is the 20th anniversary of this technology. Even though the kind of DNA testing that we're talking about, which is called autosomal DNA testing, has really only been around for a little over a decade. So Family Tree DNA being so small and down in Houston, you can actually get the founder on the phone. It just astonished me. And he's very chatty, and he'll talk to you at great length. And when I said to him, hey, I'm writing this book, what do you think about the idea of me flying down there and touring your office, and then maybe also getting a tour of your lab? What do you think about that? He said, yeah, sure. And that's what I did. So I was able to tour the oldest company, and I was able to sort of see, like, he walked me through the sort of the science of the lab itself, what's actually happening to the saliva, what's actually happening to the cells, how are they actually able to amplify and then analyze the DNA, and they have, these big computers, and it's an incredible scene. And so I just basically describe walking through. I had to wear a lab coat. I had to wear little blue booties over my sneakers. I can't remember if I had to put something on my head, like a shower curtain type thing, but it was a lab environment, so I had to kind of dress for it. And such a incredible cacophony of pneumatic whirring machines and sorters and things taking vials and putting them in different places. It was really, really cool. The other company that I toured is Ancestry, which is the behemoth in this space. And they have, I want to say at last count, 18 million test kits sold. So overall, there's 35 million DNA test kits sold, period, full stop, among these four companies. And Ancestry has sold 18 million of them. And most of these, by the way, are being sold in the United States. We're the big market for this. So Ancestry was a different picture. They were open to me coming, but they were much more cautious. I had to, there was like a sort of a thing I had to sign before I was walking in, that, stipulated that I wouldn't, like reveal anything that I saw there. And then I had to get that waived, but I couldn't even like walk through the building without us signing it. So I had to have an exception for that, like written to me so that I could actually do my reporting. And that's an incredible operation. It's compared to Family Tree DNA, it's massive. They have this new gleaming headquarters built in 2016. I think it had 800 people in it, but it could house well over 1,000. And it's a really big operation. They took me in this one room where they were doing, Ancestry is not just a DNA testing company. What's interesting about them is that they pair the DNA testing with these subscription services to genealogical materials, which is really the thing you need to use in order to understand your DNA. Just swabbing or spitting into a vial is only going to tell you so much. You need to have paper records, genealogical materials to pair with the DNA and sort of really understand it. And there was beginnings was always genealogy with Ancestry. So they had this big room where they were just actively scanning documents. So they had like it looked like a pizza, like a metal pizza, and inside it was like pages and pages, scanned pages, I guess it would be like microfilm or microfiche, of like the Ottawa Citizen newspaper from 1980 something. And they were just putting that into the system, and then I guess indexing it so that eventually at some point you'll be able to search this particular edition of the Ottawa Citizen, which is relevant to you if perhaps maybe there's a marriage announcement in that on page C10 of that particular edition, and that marriage announcement or that obituary is the key thing that's going to help an adopted person figure out her birth mother's identity. Right. So it's absolutely an incredible operation. And I feel like I saw, maybe 15% of it. There's just so much more to see.
Within that, there's all of these questions that you raise about privacy and all of the things that can be exposed when you test your DNA. How do you think the companies are responding and engaging with that? Or do you...
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's different ways of thinking about privacy issues. And I kind of think of them as like the abstract and the vividly personal. So like abstract privacy issues, which are nonetheless very important, they're just a little bit harder to concretize, would be, for instance, concerns about your test being potentially like used against you by an insurance company if you applied for like life insurance down the line and they somehow got a hold of your results, right? So there's some federal protections against genetic discrimination, but they're not foolproof. And there are types of insurance that in theory, if in theory, you could be discriminated against within the law without breaking the law if an insurance company could get a hold of your consumer DNA testing results. But I don't know of particular instances where that's happened. So that's an example of a privacy concern. Or for instance, what if a company's information gets hacked and, there have been hacks, but what if their genetic information that's in the system was revealed? How much someone could do with that information is an open question, but that is a concern. Or for instance, what about if a company gets sold from one company's gets purchased by another, and then that information goes into someone else's possession? These are all things that legal experts, privacy experts think a lot about. And so I think that that's very important. And I think about privacy in another sense too. And that is the power of it in terms of you as a human being, as an individual person in a family, and what it can reveal when coupled with the information that's available about you on the internet and on social media, right? So, for instance, there are many, many men who donated sperm back in the 1970s or the 1960s or the 1980s. And at the time, nobody anticipated DNA. And so these men were promised anonymity. And the promise of anonymity was very much part of the reason why they were willing to donate for many of them. And now we're in an environment where even if a particular donor doesn't choose to test, he is conceivably identifiable, just because there's just so many people in the databases now, 35 million people. And so, you can, if you are genetically related to someone and they're not in the database, you may be able to use a second, third, first cousin that you find in order to figure out that person's identity if you're willing to do a little bit genealogical research. And so that's another privacy question, right? And part of the interviews that I was doing with people was to understand, what do you do with the information once you have it? Okay, you test and you discover that you're the product of a non-paternity event or a not parent expected event. Now what? And for many people, that is the beginning of the journey, not the end. They then want to find out more about their genetic father. So they go on to white pages, they go on to Facebook, they go and they research their genetic father if they can understand his identity, or they go back into obits and censuses or however far back they need to go in order to figure out that man's identity. And then they start to research him. And then they want to think about, how do I contact him? Do I want to contact him? Do I want to see him and drive by and then make a decision? Maybe I drive by his house and then I think about whether I want to send him a certified letter, send him a note through Facebook Messenger, email him. And that was very interesting to me, that whole process of thinking about whether you want to know this person, what does this person mean to you? And then how does this other, if you decide to reach out, how does this other person respond? And I heard many stories, and when possible, I tried to kind of report the 360s of them. So, what does it mean for the man who, there's a story I tell in the book about a woman who is, she's she's donor conceived. She discovers that she has, I think there's 22 donor siblings plus two. So she has 23 genetic siblings through her donor father. Her donor father had 2 children with his wife, and then he had an additional 22 through sperm donation. So what does that mean for him in terms of how does he forge relationships with those children, and what does that mean for those children in terms of forging relationships with one another and with him? And that's a story that I was able to tell both from the point of view of one of his genetic daughters and also from the point of view of him, a man who donated in the 1970s and never anticipated DNA. I mean, who did? And that is a question that I think is profoundly interesting in terms of privacy, and also more broadly in terms of like how we define family and how we think about the elasticity and the capacities of the human heart, right? Like, how does this man regard these children, and what kind of relationship does he want with them, and what kind of relationship do they want with him, and how much how much should they expect, and how much he should, how does he have a relationship with them without overstepping the fact that they already have dads in many cases. All these questions were things that are so granular and individual, and each story that I tried to tell in the book, and each person that I interviewed had different answers about how much they wanted these genetic relatives in their lives, what they expected from them, and how much felt genetics should be able to tell them about who they were and who their families were and should be.
To that end, as we're kind of thinking through this sense of what it means to be Jewish, is, we're Jewish museums and Jewish organizations that are putting this on. I think this question of race and ethnicity, and especially in light of the current kind of atmosphere in the United States around white nationalism and white supremacy, that this is a real question. I'd like to go to the book itself. You say, or you quote a sociologist named Wendy Roth, who states, one of the biggest criticisms of the whole industry, particularly in the social sciences, is that the existence of these tests is going to make people think that race is buried in your genes and reinforce this essentialist view. So my question is, how is DNA testing both reinforcing racism and anti-Semitism, and are these ways that the tests are unifying people and undercutting xenophobia, or do you find there's kind of the strengthening? Where do you see the kind of what is the common response here?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I had some lengthy interviews with one of the scientists at 23andMe about this, because she was very thoughtful about her own concern about whether the tests that her company creates are actually contributing to reinforcing of a sense of racial difference, right? Race is primarily a social construct. There are differences between people, and yet it is primarily in what we make of these racial differences that you get kind of like the stereotypes and the assumptions. And so the concern for someone like this scientist, Joanna Mountain at 23andMe, is if you hand someone a pie chart that says, you're 27% this and you're 13% that, are you basically encouraging them to think about Koreans as very, very, very different from Nigerians, as very, very different from Swedes, right? And that there are these immutable, fixed, and very defined distinctions. If you can see them in a test, then surely these people must be very, very different. And then does that kind of reinforce our sense of separateness and make it harder for us to see our common humanity and our common siblinghood, right? And so when I talked to her, she said she was trying to study this. She was in the midst of studying this, and they had done they had done a study where they were canvassing people to kind of get a baseline, and they were going to see if the sense of racial reification or reinforcement was going to go up or go down, and they haven't figured that out yet. But there are a couple of sociologists who've been studying this, and there's a woman named Wendy Roth at the University of Pennsylvania, and she's done some study that suggests that it can do both. Of course, right? Because it's so complicated. Of course, it's not an easy answer. That DNA testing can reinforce sense of racial difference for people who go into a test with low genetic literacy, which is to say they don't really fully understand the kind of scientific scope of what's happening, and that it can actually lessen a sense of difference for people who go in with a sense of high literacy. So that's a neither here nor there answer to that question. I would say it's still being studied. But what I will say is that I'll give you, kind of, reason for a feeling of gloom and then reason for a feeling of hope. So reason for a feeling of gloom is that like white nationalists and white supremacists do use these tests to prove their own purity, which is not great, right? And what's interesting about it is that they are very selective in their interpretations of their results because they want to see themselves as wholly white. And when they get results that that don't support that, they will often dismiss it as, not really scientific or bunk. And this goes to, and that's, by the way, that's research that's been done on this particular group and their practices of testing. As it's all very public on message boards. So what's interesting to know about that is that we are selective in our understanding of what DNA tests can tell us, and that can be good and that can be bad, and there can be very, very valid reasons why we are selective. So reason for hope. I would say that increasingly people, I think, are seeing the diversity within themselves. And that when you test and you find you are 3% this or 10% that, and it's unexpected. And there's been studies by 23andMe showing just how much of the US population has a small percentage of, say, sub-Saharan African ancestry, indicating sub-Saharan African ancestors within the last 11 generations. I think the more that we sort of grapple with the history of this nation and understand sort of like the history of how we all came to be, I think that there's reason to be hopeful that we are not kind of throwing off our lederhosen in favor of a kilt and being very sort of flat in our thinking, but rather inclusive, in the same way that I think we can be more inclusive about family, right? We can think it's neither, or ethnicity and family. I think we can choose to be not, it is either genetics or it is experience, or it's not my bio brother or the brother I was raised with who I thought I was biologically related to, but actually he's only half biological brother, right? It's both. And increasingly from my interviews, when I talk to people, I found that they were very, very nuanced in terms of their understanding, both and their allowances and their desire to be open to relationships with family, however they defined it, often just as a matter of love, regardless of biology, and also in terms of their understanding of ethnicity or race, that as like with Alice, she didn't say, my Irish experience doesn't count. Even just because now I'm only half Irish, genetically speaking, and nor did she say my Jewishness is meaningless and something to be dismissed. She said yes and, which I think is incredibly beautiful. And I think if we can proceed with the idea that that is possible, I think that DNA tests need not be something that that encourage people to think in racist terms.
So we have a lot of questions on the board. So I'm going to jump over to there. I have a final question I'll wrap up with you later. But the first one is actually from the president of our museum. And she says, my family decided to have our oldest living relative take the test. She was 98 at the time, so that we all had the ancestry information, but maintain the privacy of younger generations. And she wants to know, is this a good strategy?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that is actually, because I think that you're able to do the genealogy, and yet if there's something in the younger generations that you're maybe not even that you're concerned about, but you're just trying to protect the privacy of them, I think that you are able to access. The thing about genealogists when they're doing DNA is they're always trying to get the older generation to test, right? The only question I think would be, if you're trying to understand, say another branch, right? So that particular relative is of course only along one particular branch. But if you could get all your oldest relatives to test, I would think that would be a very sound approach. So I think that's great.
And the next question is actually, these are two. One side of this is, how are the Mormons involved? And I think you go into that in a bit. And the other side in the same kind of question, because Ancestry is in that universe, is how do we feel about Ancestry being sold to Blackstone? Are there concerns about how that's going to change the universe?
Yeah, so Ancestry's history is, did you ask if it was a Mormon company? Was that the question?
I think the question was like, how are the Mormons? It was kind of a broad,
Yeah.
what's the role of the Mormons here?
Yeah, so it is not a Mormon company, but two of the people who were involved in founding what eventually became what we think of as Ancestry now were Mormon. And it is headquartered out in Lehi, Utah. There is some natural overlap, I would say, between the company and the Mormon community. Something to understand is that the Mormon community is very invested in genealogy. So one of the things when I did when I went out to Utah to tour Ancestry was I also toured the Family History Library, which is run by the genealogical arm of the Mormon Church. There is doctrinal reason to know your ancestors and to kind of understand like all who they are. And I write a little bit about that in the book as well, like the history of the Mormon Church and the connections to why it's so important, why genealogy is so important to the church, and why the church has been so important to the history of genealogy in the United States, which is the story that I tell. So that's a bit, that's a bit kind of interesting. I mean, there's enormous, if you are looking to do genealogical research and you don't want to pay for a subscription on Ancestry, there are many free resources, including in the world of Jewish genealogy. And there's also this entity called Family Search, which is run by the church, the Mormon Church, and it's committed to being free, and it's a service that they put out for everyone. And then they have this massive building in Salt Lake City that is like all of that's available plus more, where you can go and you see genealogical researchers lining up before the building opens at 8 a.m., at least pre-COVID. They would line up, they would have their things on roller carts that they were carrying with all their family pictures that they were planning to scan and all their documents. And they go there and they make this trek and they camp out for a week. And these are people who are Mormon and these are people who are not. And they just go there because there's unbelievable amounts of resources there. I mean, when I went there, I have some Swedish heritage. And when I mentioned that to the guy who was showing me around, he said, we have the best Swedish records anywhere outside of Sweden. He was so excited for me. So anyway, so that's sort of, that maybe answers your question about that overlap. As far as the purchase, Blackstone's, this is a private equity firm that purchased, I think, 75% of the company. It was valued, I want to say, at $4.7 billion and had been $2.6 billion just 4 years before. So you really see the growth there of that, the value of this industry. Particularly now you hear stories about people being home and having a lot of time on their hands during the pandemic and doing a lot of genealogical research. I don't know if that's true, but anecdotally you hear it repeated a lot. Having talked to a few people and read, different opinions, I don't see it as much of a difference in terms of privacy concerns for those people who've tested. I don't think that it means that Blackstone suddenly has access to all that data. It means that they own the company. But I will also confess that I didn't do any original reporting on this because it just happened. And I just sort of read a lot of news stories about it. So, I don't know what I don't know. But I hope that answers the question.
I think as much as it can in this kind of confusing era. The next two questions that I'm going to pair are kind of in the realm of story. One is from one of our viewers who had an NPE come up on her 23andMe response, is wondering if you're still collecting stories or if there's like a way of, if this is still like, or now that the book's done, you're done. And the other is kind of in that same universe, or have you talked to people who regret taking a test to begin with?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a really important question. So I love hearing stories. I don't know at the moment whether I'm going to be doing anything with them, but I love to talk to people about their stories. And I think it's very important to tell as many of these stories as possible so that we can validate the experiences of people who go through this and so that we can normalize the experience, because it is very, very common. And you still have people who think that, you know, it's just them, or that it's embarrassing. And it's just at this point, you know, it's just incredibly common. I mean, I should say that, you know, based on the data that I was able to gather, nobody like researches how many DNA surprises there are. And that's not even like that's, you could quibble for hours over even what the definition of a DNA surprise is. But if you just took people discovering that one or both their parents isn't genetically related to them, or people discovering that they have like a sibling or half sibling they didn't know about, it's probably in the low single digits of percentages of people who test overall. And so it's well over 1 million people of the 35 million people who've tested. And if you take in all the other categories, right, late discovery adoptees, discovering you have 20 siblings through a donor, discovering that I tell a story in my book of a man who didn't know he had sub-Saharan African ancestry. He was told that he was, that they were Sicilian. His mother was trying to protect him from the racial discrimination that she had faced. That's an astonishing revelation that doesn't fit into any of these other buckets. If you take all these categories, you're talking about millions of people. And then if you consider that a single revelation refracts across a family, right? My revelation that I'm not genetically related to my dad, for instance, has implications for my mom, my siblings. Then there's another family out there I'm genetically related to. It turns out I have a genetic father over there. I have half siblings through my genetic father. So a single revelation, me spitting into tube, has implications for 8 to 10 people. So literally millions of Americans are going through this right now. And there's a very long way of saying that, yes, you can email me. You can email me through my website, which is libbycopeland.com. I have a contact form there, and that's like the easiest way. And the other question is, have I talked to people who've regretted testing? That's a very good question. The people who test, who discover something unexpected about themselves, are usually like, don't wish that they could unknow the information. That's even when it's very painful. But there are a few exceptions. But rare few exceptions. However, and I'll say, I think that's because when it's about you, like what's central to your own identity, and something you weren't told, either because nobody knew or because somebody pointedly did not tell you, they made a choice not to tell you for what have been very valid historical reasons. The truth is so valuable to people in terms of their understanding of themselves, in terms of answering unanswered questions, in terms of, you know, really processing their childhoods. People want to know that information. But the people on the other side, I kind of think of them as sometimes the secret keepers, right? Let's say, you know, let's say you did, you were a sperm donor back in the 70s, or let's say that you gave your child up for adoption, and the circumstances involved coercion, either in terms of it not having been your choice to conceive a child, or violence. Those can be situations that are incredibly painful for the person who's being found, and there are people who do not wish to be found and do not want DNA testing to reveal something that happened 60 years ago. And the problem is that you don't know until you know, right? You can't know how the other person's going to react until you write that email or you send that letter. And once you've approached them, you've potentially opened up a wonderful relationship, or you've peeled the Band-Aid off a wound. And suddenly maybe their children know, maybe your aunt and uncle, newly discovered aunt and uncle, like it's a thing. It's a whole thing. And it could be the beginning of something beautiful, or it could be something very painful. And it's heartbreaking to see, children and mothers, or children and fathers, people who are intimately genetically related, whose interests are so divergent. And those are the stories I really was interested in telling. The heartwarming reunions, yes, you read a lot of those. If you pick up like the paper and the features section of the newspaper, you read a lot of those, and I wanted to tell those because they're amazing, and they're true. And I also wanted to tell the stories that reveal that there are not always happy endings or neat endings. They're very complicated, and these are open questions that like Americans are processing like every day now.
So, as we wrap up here, you spent a lot of time exploring this industry, its impact, the challenges. What would be your recommendations in terms of using recreational DNA testing? What do you think, our role should be?
Yeah, well, I mean, I should disclose that I've done DNA testing. My DNA is in 3 databases. And, I think if you are someone who is cautious, either because you have reason to be cautious, because you think there may be some secrets in my family, let sleeping dogs lie, or because you have concerns about, privacy concerns, data concerns, 10 years down the road, how are they going to use this information, which is a valid question to which no one can offer an answer. I would say, cool, don't test if you don't want to test. I wouldn't push people to do it if it's not their inclination. On the other hand, I would say, for me, DNA testing has been remarkable. We discovered my dad's second cousin in Sweden through the DNA databases, not someone we would have discovered any other way. And we were actually able to go to Sweden in late 2019, before the pandemic, before anyone knew it was coming. And we were able to meet my dad's second cousin and her daughter, who's a genealogist. And it was this remarkable access to the past. My dad's grandmother had come over from Sweden in the 1890s. And there we were, touching a piece of family furniture and seeing her farmhouse and seeing her schoolhouse and seeing her church. Wow, mind-blowing. And on my mother's side, we're Ashkenazi Jewish. And I was able to, we were able to find a DNA second cousin to my mom, who, from a line of people who we would have assumed did not survive World War II. And they did survive, and they lived in Ukraine, and they survived through the USSR, and then they went to Israel, and then they came to New York. And so again, without DNA, not possible. So I would just say, obviously it varies, but I guess the lesson to me is the immediacy of the past. The past really isn't over. You see that over and over again in all the stories that I tell. The good stories, the bad ones, the nuanced ones, they're all nuanced. They're all complicated. We are all shaped by these things that happened 10 years ago, 120 years ago. And this just happens to be the very moment that that everything is coming to the surface. And I think it's a profound cultural moment. I think we're going to look back and we're going to say, holy cow, this is the moment that everything changed. This is the moment that genetic family secrets were over. No such thing as family secrets anymore. This is the moment when we started rethinking our relationship to our assumptions about race and ethnicity. And I think we need to be talking about this more, and really understanding, the importance of this period of time that we're in.
Thank you so much. I think I'm unmuted. Thank you so much, Libby. This was wonderful. And it's in the chats, you'll have to look through it. There are a lot of comments that are coming up. One person is talking about a family cousin who found them through DNA testing, who had been given up for adoption, and the family had been coerced the mother had been coerced to do that. And
reading it, it's beautiful.
It's amazing. And it's just such an interesting world. And I think your book really highlights all of the different gray areas that exist. And it's so thought-provoking. And thank you for sharing that kind of depth and interest with us here tonight.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate being here, and it's been such a thrill. So thank you.
You are welcome. It is my pleasure now to introduce Anna Goldstein from the Young Leadership Division of the Milwaukee Jewish Federation, who's going to give us a little closing.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to say thank you to Libby, and also thank you to Ellie and Cassie and Molly and the whole JMM staff. We were very excited to co-sponsor this program. We convene Jewish young adults in the Milwaukee Jewish community. We are planning some good programs for the fall with our Young Leadership Division Council. We have some racial justice programmings coming up. We're planning some social programs, including maybe a cooking class, and some professional development as well for those who are looking for work, or maybe are looking to do a change in their job. We also have young family programming and Shalom baby programming for both expecting parents and new parents, to just try to keep everyone sane and connected during this crazy time. But otherwise, thank you so much for letting us co-sponsor, and I think this was a wonderful event, and I will pass it back off to Ellie.
Thank you, Anna. As a reminder, this is a program in partnership with YLD and JMM and the National Museum of American Jewish History. We had a listener from Alaska, Libby. We're like, really, we're getting the whole country.
That's really awesome.
Yay, Barbara from Alaska. Thank you for sharing that. You can order this book through our website. Cassie's about to put the link in the chat. So, and we can give it to you curbside if you're in Milwaukee. We can also ship it out to you wherever you are in the country. It is a great read. I think if you're in a book club, it is an excellent book club read because it brings up so many questions. And by the end of the night, you're going to know everyone's DNA history and all of these things that come up. It'll be probably one of your best conversations ever, I would guess. I also want to take a moment to say, to echo Dan, that this is a really interesting moment to be a museum professional and to work in museums where we're always under budgetary constrictions. Whatever you can do to help us, we appreciate it. The donations will be split tonight between National Museum of American Jewish History and Jewish Museum Milwaukee, and we appreciate your support, and thank you to all of you who already made a donation. I have two quick programs to plug. One, go to Namaj's lunchtime Ladino series, and then come in the evening to our opening preview of Luba Lukova, Designing Justice. This new exhibit opens to the public next week, and because we can't have a big group of people celebrating in person, we're going to have them all on Zoom, and it's going to be a lovely evening with Luba Lukova herself talking about her work and local artist Little Revs singing protest songs in celebration of our collaboration exhibit, Shakespeare in the Alley, which is a reflection on Bob Dylan. Then on September 23rd at noon, these times are in Central Time, East Coasters and Pacific Coasters and Alaska time people, we are going to have a lunch and learn virtual tour of the Jewish Museum of London. And I'm so excited about this. Their chief engagement officer is going to go through the history of Jews in Britain from 1066, going through all of the migrations and challenges and highlighting some of the pieces from their collection. You may not be able to travel, but that doesn't mean you can't go there virtually. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. We hope to see you again, and have a wonderful evening.